Thanks everybody. It's great to be here and great to have this turnout. I'm here to talk, as you know, about the Financial Advice Code, which is a sort of working title that we use, but I am delighted that in the full title of the code, which you see up on the screen, it's still got that word professional. And at the end of it all, the code is all about attitude and aspiration. And if we lose that professionalism mojo in what we're doing, it all really doesn't matter. So, having that focus there of professionalism, whatever it means to different people, because everybody's got a different spin on it, but it makes people think more broadly than rules, and that's what the code is trying to do. I've got to press the green button apparently, and it worked. So I suppose the most important thing about the code in terms of the way the regime works is that it's part of this broader regime. It doesn't stand alone. The code applies if a couple of triggers are met, and those triggers are, it's got to be regulated financial advice, and that's defined in the legislation, and the client has to be a retail client, again defined. And then the code does two things. It provides standards of conduct, how you interact with your client, and it also provides standards of competence, the competence and skills you need in order to carry out that interaction. But it's the fit, its place in the overall regime that is critical. And so if you see the moving parts, and you saw those in Sharon's presentation, you've got the legislation, you've got the regulations, you've got the FMA license, and you've got the code itself. So obviously in the code working group's deliberations, we've spent a lot of time thinking about what conduct standards look like, what do competence standards look like, but we've spent as much time, if not more, understanding that fit. And the feedback that we've got through our consultation processes from you and others has been incredibly helpful in trying to get that fit right, working out what belongs with the legislation, what belongs with the code, and what belongs with licensing. And so just a few words about that. The code tries to apply to every advice situation. So there's some things, particularly process-related things that relate to the financial advice provider, the entity, if you like, that don't actually belong particularly neatly in the code and are best left for licensing, and we've attempted to do that. We've tried to keep in the code those things that can apply in one way or another to all advice situations. So that's looking in the direction of the process, if you like, but looking in the direction of the overall umbrella of what's around the advice process. We look to the legislation and note that this legislation has picked up some things that under the old Financial Advisors Act lived in the code itself. So when you talk about giving priority to clients' interests at the time of a conflict, or when you talk about the nature and scope of advice, those things were dealt with in slightly different ways in the code itself in the previous regime. Those now sit in the legislation, and we've been respectful of that. We've tried not to trample in that area. And lastly, when it comes to the disclosure regulations, we've tried to leave it to the regulations to deal with how you need to tell your clients things. We focus more on the principles about understanding. So throughout the code, we have continued this theme of a principles-based approach. We want it, as I say, to apply to, in a flexible way, to a wide range of situations, and we want you to be able to determine what your business model looks like. It is not the code's role to tell you how to structure your business. The code needs to be able to articulate principles of advice that would apply in all situations. I don't know whether that actually, yes it did. So we've tried really hard to make sure that the code is not a rule book. We've tried to design some signposts. When you start to discuss professionalism and conduct, it's very easy for them, as they sort of, as you sort of treat them as buzzwords, for them to mean all sorts of different things. And I don't think the code's job is to give you the precise answer, but it is to help you, to point you in the right direction of your thinking so that you can do the right thing by your client. So we're setting the standard, we're not setting rules. We've got commentary in the code, and you will have seen this from our consultation towards the end of last year. That commentary is there to aid compliance. And quite interestingly, when it comes to competence, those people who've operated under the Financial Advisors Act are used to the competence standard that says you need to pass this exam, basically. And now we've moved to a competence standard that's much more a principle, and then in addition to articulating that principle of competence and doing it in a way that it applies whether you're a human being or whether you're an entity, which proved to be quite difficult, we also articulate a non-exhaustive list of ways of demonstrating that competence to help you, so that if you don't directly meet what's set out in the standard, there are some other ways that you can do it and be assured that that is also complying with the standard. So a big part of the code, of course, is to make sure that the code is helping meet the purpose obligations of the legislation. Now, the advice provisions have those two key provisions of making sure that the quality of advice is maintained, but also that advice is available. But on top of that, there's some broader obligations in the legislation, and there's some up there on the screen that we've been really conscious of. And can I just highlight the avoiding unnecessary compliance costs? Doing unnecessary things in the client interaction, burdening your client with paper that the client is unlikely to ever read and unlikely to get any benefit from. I mean, although part of that job is the disclosure regulations, we've tried really hard not to create a world where compliance complicates the interaction with the client rather than supporting and enhancing it. So I've already mentioned briefly that we're grateful for the feedback that we've got through consultation, but I'd like to say a big thank you in all of our rounds of consultation for the feedback received. It's been incredibly helpful, and you've all played a part in that. In terms of the next step, the code has now gone to the Minister, as you know. There are sort of two triggers before we go beyond that. The Minister's review has to happen, and he's required to liaise with the FMA in that process, and the legislation has to pass. You can see from the conversation today that things are now moving really, really quickly, and we expect that to be a smooth process. Well, maybe smooth is a bit optimistic. I'm sure we'll have some conversations, but I'm sure it's going to happen. Next out from us will be the publications of the submissions that we received from our October-November consultation. So that's only a few days away. It's close, and I can't see the rest of my slides, so I can't remember the rest of my points. I don't know whether there's a way of bringing it back again. The last point on the slide was next steps in terms of what you can do. Oh, there we are. Yes, sorry, then after that, we will, when the code's ready, we'll publish the code with the impact analysis and the summary of submissions. And to quickly explain what that is, the impact analysis looks at how the code, if you like, delivers to the purpose statements of the legislation. And the summary of submissions takes all of your submissions and includes some articulation from us about how we've responded to those things. And it's a bit pointless publishing those supporting documents without the code itself. So that'll come. Future maintenance of the code is not a static document. This space will evolve over time, so there will be future iterations of the code. Next steps for you, obviously your big focus now as licensed businesses or people working within the regime is to look at how you're going to satisfy the licensing requirements. But from a code point of view, two messages. The first message is the big thing about complying with the conduct standards is how you and your business put clients first. So think about how you do that. How do you treat clients fairly? and you're going to get to the right answers that way. And in terms of competence, we've been talking about level 5 for a long time. I'm not going to go into the detail of precisely how that's played out in the code, but that's the zone you need to be looking at. I should add there that we're taking the focus away from just that introductory educational standard, and we're trying to get people to think about their continuing professional development as well. And if anything, that becomes more important than just getting to that baseline standard. And that's us. Thank you very much indeed.